Having written the article, British Sikhs are the best example of cultural integration, could you tell us about your experience with the Sikh community?
Well, in Dartford, my constituency, Sikhs are the highest ethnic minority in terms of population. We've got a Gurdwara in Dartford, which I've visited on numerous occasions. I've had a lot to do with the Sikh community locally. We have some of our local councillors as are active in the Sikh community as well. There's a Sikh by the name of Avtar Sandhu, who's very active, was county councillor, now borough councillor. So I've had sort of dealings on a political level with Sikhs, but also having sort of grown up in the area as well, I've had a regular contact with Sikhs throughout that time as well.
Mm-hmm. With regards to cultural integration, do you feel that society has an unbalanced view of immigrants that are bad for this country?
I think people are beginning to realise that actually there's a benefit from having controlled immigration. That actually we can have people come into this country that have value to give, something they can add to society, add to our country, they can contribute. I think the negativity people see is when that immigration becomes uncontrolled, when you get bad elements coming in with the majority that are coming in for good reasons, when they feel it's out of control, when they feel that there's too many people coming in and our public services can't cope as a consequence. I think that's when people's concerns are raised. But I think generally speaking, people recognise the fact that actually some immigration into this country is a good thing, it's a positive thing for this country.
Well, talking about immigration, do you think we need tighter controls on our borders?
Yes, I think we've seen for too many years that there's been a lack of control on our borders. I think there is scope, I think, to tighten up. I think that's something the government has been working on. We've had this stated goal of moving from hundreds of thousands of people coming into this country down to tens of thousands. I think that makes sense. And I think it's right that we have some idea of who's coming into our country and who's not. And you're never going to have that idea unless you have proper controls in place.
When an individual comes here, say from the EU, do you think they should be entitled to the benefits from our welfare system, or?
Not straight away.
Not straight.
I think there needs to be a contribution that's been made to this country, either in the amount of time you spend living here or in the work that you put in and pay through taxation. I think that's fair. I think that's right. You know, I think yes, we want to be able to pick people up who've fallen down, but I think this concept that you can immediately come into a country and then straight away claim benefits is one that sits uncomfortably with me. I wouldn't expect that if I went abroad and lived elsewhere, and I don't think most people would expect that coming into this country. So I think it's right that we have a period of time where people have an opportunity to contribute to this country before we allow people to be eligible for benefits.
What about when someone comes here, say on holiday or whatever, and they might be in their 8th term of pregnancy and they actually have a child here? Should they then have to pay for the NHS, or should we help them out?
Yeah. But in the same way as that if I go abroad, I take out medical insurance so that if I fall sick, then I can have my health treatment covered by insurance. I think that same should apply to people coming into this country. I don't think that the catchphrase has been that we have a national health service, not an international health service, and I think that's a fair way of summing up things. You know, if people come to this country, then yes, of course you want to treat them, but there shouldn't be an abuse of the system, so that I think it's fair to expect foreign nationals that come into the UK to pay for their own treatment, either through insurance or through their own contributions themselves, if they have to use the health provision we have in this country.
Do you think compulsory ID cards would help solve the problem of immigration and people misusing the NHS?
There's not a lot of evidence that it would, in terms of the cost that it would have to have a proper identity system. When it's been looked at in the past, the figures that play in my mind is about £4 billion that was going to cost to have a proper national identity system. That money could be better spent elsewhere on enforcing our borders, in policing our borders. The problem is, of course, with any identity card system is that are you going to make people carry their identity cards at all times, in which that clearly an infringement on people's liberties, or are you going to allow people time to hand their identity card into a police station at a later date? Well, if you do that, then people who are trying to abuse the system are not going to carry their cards with them. So actually it ends up being the law-abiding people end up being penalised from an identity card system, and those people who are breaking the law actually aren't affected so much. So whilst I don't think it's something that should ever be ruled out, I think we need to appreciate that, look, if the benefits from the money is better spent elsewhere than on an identity card system, then that's where we should spend it rather than on a card system that may be fundamentally flawed.
While Labour was in government, they actually came up with a proposal and they tried to pass a bill through Parliament for the identity cards. What was your views on that? Were you for or against it?
Well, as I say, the problem comes through is that, okay, we can have a card system which most law-abiding people haven't got a particular problem with, but it becomes a waste of money if we're spending that on an ineffective system, where actually we could spend that money instead on a system that would be far more effective in improving the controls we have on our borders and the policing of our borders. There's only so much money in the pot, obviously, and if you're better off spending that money on policing than you are on an identity card system, then fine. Then that's what we should be doing. Actually, when those proposals were made, the police weren't wildly enthusiastic about it. Immigration service were not wildly enthusiastic about it. It wasn't really seen as some sort of magic wand that was going to make everything better. So actually, I think some of the criticisms that were levelled at the system, I think, were quite valid. So I'm yet to be convinced, if I can put it that way, that an identity card system would work in the UK.
Going on to a second topic, hypothetically, if there was a second vote in Parliament for intervention in Syria, how would you vote?
It's very hypothetical.
Very hypothetical.
Very hypothetical. I don't anticipate, unless there's some dramatic changes, that we will have another vote. If there are those dramatic changes, well, let's see what those dramatic changes are. It was quite clear in Parliament before that there was a democratic view in Parliament that there was no desire for military action at that time. I would have to see what it was that was so significant that made us have a second vote before making my mind up on that, and I'd have to have a lot of reassurances.
Which way did you vote in the first vote?
I supported the government. I felt that we need to look at the option of having military action. As you're aware, it wasn't a vote for military action, it was a vote to take note of what was happening in Syria and look at the possibility of military action in the future. I think the issue for me was that there are huge dangers in taking military action, and there are huge dangers in not taking military action. We've seen at the moment that Syria has been prepared to move on the issue of chemical weapons and hand over perhaps some of its chemical weapons, but I think what has focused Syria's mind, the government now, on being cooperative is this looming threat of military action. I don't think it's been diplomacy that has done this. I think it's the fact that they're looking down the barrel of a gun, metaphorically speaking, and that has spurred them on to be far more cooperative in handing over their chemical weapons. At the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want the Syrian regime to stop abusing its own people, stop using chemical weapons, stop flouting international law. And how we achieve that, really, I'm quite open-minded about. But what we need to do is to achieve that, because it's not right that we can see the Syrian people being murdered by its own government and for us to sit back and do nothing.
In crisis like Syria, at what stage would you support an intervention?
Well, I think that there were. I mean, it's been called a red line that's been crossed by the regime that's there at the moment, and therefore I think that we had to take action. We couldn't ignore that. As an international community, I think if we were to say, well, you've used chemical weapons, you've carried out war crimes, and we are going to do nothing about it, that would have been quite wrong. I think it's correct that the international community says, no, there are lines that you do not cross, and they've crossed that, and therefore we are going to act. How we act and the way we approach it obviously is still up for discussion, and we need to look at a very evolving situation. As we speak at the moment, things have changed rapidly from this morning compared with this afternoon. So, we need to ensure that we are moving with that and keeping up to date. But I do think that it's right that the international community doesn't sit back and do nothing about someone breaching international law in such a fundamental way.
There's some views in the community that we should have intervened way before the chemical weapons kind of idea came out. So because there were still human rights issues in Syria. Do you agree with that, or?
I think it's a difficult one because we don't want to get ourselves in a situation where we're taking sides in a civil war. We don't want to come in and say, well, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys and we're going to help you out. That would be wrong. And so therefore I think it would be very difficult to intervene at an earlier stage. I think the line that had been crossed was the extensive use of chemical weapons, and that actually made it the international community's responsibility to respond to that. It wasn't the civil war in itself.
On the 30th of August, it was the day of the disappeared. What can this government do to help those citizens who are just being picked up on the streets by law enforcement and then just kind of getting vanished without a trace?
Well, we can work with those governments, those countries where these sort of incidents are happening. I think the Foreign Office has been working very hard on this sort of thing. There's always a limit to what we can, what we should do about what's happening in other people's countries, but certainly if we can show our support for open democratic processes in countries, then I think that we can give that leadership that hopefully illustrates to other countries that some of the practices are not right, they're not correct, and they shouldn't be followed.
Do you feel that the government has an obligation to communicate and put pressures on countries like China and India where human rights aren't being upheld?
There is a role for us to play. I think certainly, what we need to ensure is that, we can say, well, look, we find this form of government unacceptable. We find this form acceptable. We have a democratic society. We're proud of that. I don't think there's any harm in saying to countries that don't have democracy that actually we think that their system's wrong. I think there is, again, that line that we don't want to cross where you start going and telling other countries how they should run their affairs. But equally, I think it's right to say, well, look, we believe in a democratic, open society. These are the benefits that we think come from that, and that should be a way of explaining to people, look, that this is something that you could pursue without any fear of repercussions on your own government. But I don't want us to get into a situation where we are telling other countries how they should run their affairs. Quite often that can have a counterproductive effect, and people will start putting up the barriers and saying, you have no right to tell us how to run our own affairs. But we need to ensure that through the United Nations, through other international organisations, that we are saying, well, look, democracy is the correct way forward. People should have a right to have a say in how their countries are run, and I don't think there's any harm in us championing that.
And lastly, the purpose of this initiative is to get people to vote for the party that best represents their views. Is there anything you'd like to say to those voters?
As to why they should vote Conservative?
Yeah.
Well, we're doing so much at the moment. I mean, there is so much that we are achieving. I think we're offering at the next general election a referendum on the European Union. If people want to stay in or they want to get out, then they'll have that option. The only mainstream party that's offering that is the Conservatives. We have frozen council tax. We have taken thousands, in fact millions of people out of paying any kind of income tax at all. I think that's a wonderful achievement. We've spoken about immigration, how we are actually restricting the numbers that are coming in from outside of the EU and getting some sort of control over the problem. What we have done as well in other areas across the economy is we're tackling the deficit, which is the biggest problem this country has faced. Crime is down, which is fantastic news. I think we're getting to common sense injected into the education system, so things like spelling tests and such are coming back in, which makes absolute sense to me. There's lots of issues that we are, I think, leading the way on. It's disappointing, I suppose, that the Labour Party hasn't seemed to come up with any kind of alternatives. You take what they call the bedroom tax, which we call the spare room subsidy. It's a classic illustration of that, is that they will criticise us for the spare room subsidy, but they are unwilling to say themselves whether or not they would bring it in themselves, whether they would support it, and what they would do. I still don't know. And that's what's been their approach all along with cuts that we have brought in. So when we bring in a particular cut in spending on public service, they are very quick to criticise it, but very slow to say what they would do as an alternative. So when the elector comes to the polling day in 2015 and makes that decision, it's going to be very unclear what they would be voting for if they were to support a Labour government.
All right, thank you very much.